Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to review this sword right here. It is a Dynasty Forge Musha series Shobu Zakuri Katana in a Musashi theme. I don't know exactly the model name or how you would say it, but that's the basic gist, and I'll put a link in the description down below to Dynasty Forge's website where you can find more information about this specific one, as well as a link to Cult of Athena if you wanted to buy it there, as well as weapon dynamics and specifications and all that kind of crap. Anyway, do know before I do the review, I'm not an expert in these kind of things, and this one came to me gratis from a fellow sword friend who sent it to me for free for the purposes of doing this review. It's not a company that sent it to me, it's an actual human being that gave it to me as a gift, which means I'm kind of, well, I want to really like it because it's a gift of a sword, and that's very personal to me, and I really appreciate it. And so I will say that it's I have to like the sword. I'm compelled to do it, but I will try to be as objective in this review as possible. Anyway, now you know the story about it. It's secondhand and a gift, and therefore, if you think that makes me biased, now you know at the beginning. Anyway, I'm going to go over, try to do a review, top to bottom, soup to nuts on the sword, kind of show you its bits and bobs and all of that stuff. I will note that unlike some other reviews where I try to show you those features while it's still in new condition, or as I got it condition, that is not the case here. Obviously, the sword has been used and it's in a slight condition-related issue. Anyway, I do know that I've used it, not extensively, and I don't think it came to me particularly used either, but anyway, it's not, I've used it, I've cut with it, I've done some things with it, and so you're going to see the results of those condition-related things, which I'll touch on and how they happen, and if I think they're acceptable or not. The short answer is no. But, you know, sneak peek, I guess, for the review. Anyway, I'm going to start with the kasha up here, the pommel, the end cap, and I will also note that this sword has a lot in common with a cold steel katana, which I will compare it to later on at the end of the review. There's some speculation that they're made in the same place. I happen to have a cold steel warrior katana still handy, one that I used in a different video, and there are a lot of similarities. One thing that I will say is, yeah, there's a lot of similarities, frankly, and one thing that I'm fortunate is similar is the kashra and the fittings on here. Now, obviously, this is a different theme, but the cold steel I gave some compliments to in terms of its price point and the fittings quality that it came with. The lines are elegant, they're friendly from a user perspective, they have some cool artistic styling, and I think that's no exception here. This is what's called, I believe, a Higo style, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, kashra, and in a nutshell, I think it's good. There's no sharp ledges, the casting quality looks overall pretty good, and it's got a kind of metal shitadome here that don't bite my hands, like I recall one of the pieces on the cold steel doing. But obviously there are some downsides to it as well, namely that I really can't compare how the transitions line up here. I wanted to say they bunched up a little bit, but that's because the knot came undone. Now, this is a very common thing in Japanese swordsmanship, the knot coming undone, particularly on less expensive mass production swords. You will take a swing and then this little knot will come undone, and gradually it will get worse, and the old, you know, duct tape or hockey tape on the handle is typically what follows. I'll try to show you in a different video, not this one, how to do some potential fixes on this kind of stuff, albeit they're not fixes. They're very MacGyver-y solutions, because getting it back to the way it was usually requires some sort of investment in having somebody that knows how to tie these things, redo it. You can't often reuse the Ito, but there are some solutions that are passable on the cheap with what you might have around your house or be able to get at a hardware store. Anyway, the basic gist is the knot coming undone is not good. This sword was not extensively used. It has traveled around, it is old, but the knot coming undone and this thing coming as loose as it did is something that's very unfortunate. Unfortunately, very common as well, but not particularly fun, and an unfortunate thing that made me stop while I was doing cutting and things like that. The kashra came off, and rather than make it worse, I just kind of stopped there and called it on the cutting, which I'll show you later. It did a reasonable job, but I suppose that's for a bit later in the review. Suffice to say, though, the piece itself, I think, is actually quite good. The craftsmanship in terms of securing it, I would say I'm not enthusiastic about. I suppose that brings us up to the Ito. Now, I can't really comment on this transition since it's come undone. I would say it's a little bunchy, but I can't show you its original shape, so I will just show you the rest. It's a black silk, and the rest of the Ito is reasonably tight. I mean, you can kind of see I can move it around, but it's reasonable. It didn't loosen in any other noticeable way other than a very, very important one. It didn't loosen on any of the knots as I was manipulating the sword or anything. And I would say that it's acceptably tight, but not exactly what anyone would hope for. The overall shape of the handle is reasonably pleasing. Again, I find this about right in terms of how the cold steel one was as well. It's not axe handly, but it is on the big side, and I find it to be pretty comfortable in my hands. It doesn't have any particular interesting shape to it. It doesn't, you know, swell or sweep or do do anything, but as far as handles go, I find it comfortable to hold on to and manipulate. A quick note on the Samegawa, it doesn't appear to be anything particularly special, all very small nodule Samegawa. Again, inexpensive sword, I'm expecting that. It's always a pleasant thing when I see large nodules, but I don't know if that's a detail that most people are expecting or really care that much about in a sword of this price point. Back to the Ito though, you can notice that the diamonds do wander quite a bit, big to small, small to big. They bounce around all over the place, and the Ito is also showing some signs of handling. So this is, again, this has been used for EI and some cutting and whatnot, but I would again say not extensively so. And you'll see that much is substantiated when I get to the blade. But this handling is kind of what it looks like, how the silk ages from not used to somewhat used over here. The Minuki are of a reasonable quality, and I can't necessarily make out what they are. I want to say that's like a dragon, and this one is a, I don't know, probably dragons. I'm not sure. I haven't really looked very closely at what the Minuki are, but the casting quality at a glance looks reasonable. If I move on to the Fuchi up here, there is a transition, there is a ledge that slightly overlaps, but it's not grotesque or anything, and I didn't find it to be uncomfortable while I was moving the sword around. And again, I like this, it has some dimension to it. Obviously it has some ribbing or some sort of, it's not just basically a plain flat sheet of metal, and I like the overall kind of patina, the coloration on it. It's also held up well. I mean, again, the sword, you can see how the handling has taken to the silk. So obviously somebody has handled this some to some extent, and none of the patina has come off. So that's a good sign. One somewhat quirky note is I only see one Mikugi peg on here, and if I go down the handle, I don't see where the other one is. Usually there are two, but in this case I'm only seeing the one Mikugi. I suppose I'll know when I try to take the handle off. Now I'll tell you a little bit about the tsuba right here, and basically this Musashi style tsuba is one of the more common styles out there, and this one has some dimension to it. So a lot of times they're just cutouts and they're not really specific or particularly interesting, but you can see here that this one has just a little bit of depth to it. There's some ledges and some rims, and basically it has a little bit more shape to it than if it were just a simple kind of water jet cutout. It's also comfortable, doesn't bite my hands, nothing, if a finger gets in here, it doesn't hurt. So from a practitioner standpoint, the fitting set is handsome, at least from my perspective. This is the habaki, and the habaki is nothing particularly special, simple brass habaki. I do like how Dynasty Forge uses this kind of horizontal pattern. There's some, I suppose, dimension to it that's just marginally different in terms of shape than what I'm used to. That said, I'm not a big fan of this kind of brass habaki. I guess it's just a material. It's a subjective thing. I just see it used very often in swords, and so I find it, to kind of be the standard, and I'm just not a fan of it personally. You can see along the spine here, there's a little bit of gapping. It doesn't fit as well as it could, but it does the job in terms of being a habaki. Now, tension-wise, it's not really fair to say on the saya, but it does just fall out. It would be easy enough to shim, and yeah, it didn't come fitting particularly well. It's on the loose side, but it's something that would be easily remedied. That brings us to the saya. First, I will show you the koiguchi area here, and this is a little lackluster. It doesn't have a whole lot of shape and dimension, and there's some kind of schmutz left on the outside. I find this to be one of the more unsightly ones, but again, very similar to what Cold Steel has on offer. Later I'll compare them kind of side by side so you can see, but in general this looks very similar to the scabbard from Cold Steel. It didn't come split at the koiguchi. In the process of practicing, I've lost a little piece, and wondering where that was from. It looks like the kurikata has come loose. I'll zoom in on that in just a moment, but it doesn't come out exactly, but it's come loose enough where I gotta fix it now. You kind of make out that it moves around. It's in this kind of little pocket, and the dried paint is kind of what's holding it on by friction, but It's loose here, and that makes it challenging from a practitioner standpoint to use. Could come out and be made worse at any time. So again, this will be something I'll fix in some other video at some point. But you can see that the koiguchi, or the kurigata, this little thing that holds the sai on, is broken. It's also worth noting that this is usually how they are. There's just basically wood that's glued and lacquered over, or horn that's lacquered on. It's just glue holding these things in. They do tend to crack pretty easily. It's interesting that this one cracked in such a way that it's still kind of on there. It appears that the kurigata is just wood, and then here it also has these kind of brass shirodome, these washer kind of spacer things. And this is what always happens with these. They come out and then they bounce around and scratch the paint. I really don't. I like them glued in. I like them secure and well made, or just not in there at all. These are tied on so that they don't go far, but anyway, I'm not a fan of when they pop out like this. The Sagi-haba is of reasonable quality. I actually happen to like this one. I don't know if it's original to the blade, but I believe it is. Also, like the cold steel, it comes with a metal kojiri. Again, same type of things. It has a slight ledge on the end, but I like that it comes with a metal kojiri, and it matches the theme of this kind of Higo style theme. The lacquer on it is reasonably nice. This one came with less scratches and less blemishes, but it does seem to be on the thinner paint side rather than a thick coat of gloss on it. It looks to be a little thinner, though. Again, this one is in overall good shape, and I do honestly like the side dimension. It's a little thicker up here, and it gradually thins down. For an inexpensive sword, that's something that I often see missed most of the time in this $300 category or $500 category. They're just kind of one tube of the same dimension all the way across. All right, onto the blade, the pointy stabby part, and I'm going to start with what makes this blade a Shobu. Before I do, know that there are some silver markings on the blade. Those are Sharpie from me taking the Weapon Dynamics computer measurements. It wipes off, but I haven't taken them off for this part of the review. Anyway, I'm going to start with the Kisaki and the area that makes this blade the so-called Shobu Zakuri blade. Basically, you can kind of see how this blade doesn't have a distinguished yakote, or basically this line that designates where the tip is that you commonly see on a lot of Japanese swords. From my understanding, it's common to see the spine of the blade, kind of this area on a Shobu Zakuri blade, run all the way up to the top, though this thing kind of gradually tapering off in an iris leaf shape doesn't necessarily make it not Shobu Zakuri, though I get a little fuzzy on how the geometry works. You can see that the blade does have some swelling, or basically the spine rolls in and then gradually rolls out on this tip as well. To me, this doesn't quite seem like a Shobu Zakuri blade, but it's what the mass production market calls it, and I don't think, well, I guess I don't know enough to say that it isn't. But generally speaking, the classic examples of Shobu Zakuri, I see this reinforced ridgeline run all the way out to the tip, and that's commonly what I see in Shobu, but this is not that. And a lot of other manufacturers outside of Dynasty Forge call this a Shobu Zakuri tip. It's odd, though, if you just put a yakote and scratched one on, then this would be just an Okasaki blade. So I don't know much about the geometry that separates it from other types of geometry, shy of just missing this arbitrary line designating where the tip would be. Anyway, that's my thoughts on it. You can see that this is a mono steel blade, or basically one uniform type of steel blade. There's no hara, there's no folding pattern, there's no hamon or any kind of artistic, interesting bits to the sword. It's a unique shape, I suppose, in that Shobu Zakuri aren't terribly common, but there's not really much to see on the blade itself. This one, unlike the cold steel, came with a reasonable edge on it. I wouldn't say it's as sharp as I would like it to be, but it's sharp enough that I don't really want to rub my thumb on it any more than I am right now. I would call it sufficiently sharp, but it's certainly not quite the razor's edge that you would hope for. Anyway, you're also able to see that it has had some scratches, but overall the blade is not used significantly. It doesn't have thousands and thousands and thousands of cuts on it. Again, here's my markings from the Weapon Dynamics computer. It doesn't look like it was used quite a lot. So you can kind of make out, here are the scratches. Let me see if I can get my light to cooperate just a little better with me. So you're able to make out some of the scratches in the surface of the steel here. And the reason I think that's important is it doesn't necessarily tell me how much it was dry handled in terms of doing EI and things like that, but I can tell that this blade was not used extensively for cutting. And so this thing, the handle, the kashira coming off, it's not because the sword was used extensively. It might have been handled quite a bit, but that doesn't, well, basically no part of this sword tells me that it has enough miles on it to justify that kind of thing happening. And while it is common, I do find it unfortunate for a sword with so few miles on it, so to speak. Anyway, the sword itself, it has a high shinogi. It lends itself well to cutting. I would say that the edge needs to be sharper than it is if you're going to do a lot of tatami type cutting, but as it is, the sword is handsome. Forgive again the ugly bits of Sharpie that are on there, but I think you can get the idea in terms of what to expect. There's not really a ton of detail to see in this sword. It's a simple, quasi mirror polished blade. Now, in terms of dynamics and moving this around, obviously I've noted that the edge is not terribly sharp. I mean, it's sharp, but not as razor sharp as you might need it or want it to be. In terms of bottle cutting and things like that, it did the job just fine. In terms of tatami cutting, it was okay until I lost the kashira, or this thing came undone, and then I pretty much called it from there. But until that point, it was doing okay for not having a kind of refined edge. I didn't bother sharpening this. I didn't keen it up. I didn't do anything, which I've done on some other swords. In this case, it seems sufficient, and I bet if I were to refine the edge, which it doesn't look like it would require a lot of effort to do, it seems like it's in a very good shape to just maybe take a strop or depending on your method. I use a belt sander with a strop and jeweler's rouge on it. I'm pretty confident that I could probably get the keenness out of it that I'd like with just a few passes on that. Anyway, it was okay in cutting, but obviously I stopped when the kashira came off. I didn't want to make it any worse. Until then, though, in terms of moving it around, I did other examples where I did EI and things like that with it, and it's a more comfortable blade to move around than the cold steel counterpart that it is. It's still heavy, it's still tip heavy. It's not something I would recommend using for EI. It's a bit stout in the hand, but overall, I would say that it was at least marginally more comfortable. I do have to recognize that I'm not a cold steel fanboy, so I do want to say I'm a little biased, and I kind of have it in my mind to not like those products, but I would say that this one feels a little better, and measurably so. I've provided links to the weapon dynamics computer below so you can contrast this one versus the cold steel. There are some differences. They're very similar in size and stature and weight, but there are some differences in the dynamics, and one could argue that those subtle differences would make you maybe subtly like it more. That said, it's very similar to the cold steel warrior sword, so if you like that one, then you'll probably like this one, and if you don't, then you likely won't. If you just wanted it to be a little bit more refined, then maybe this would be a contender, though I don't know. They're very, very similar blades. Speaking of, why don't I actually show you? All right, I'm going to make an attempt to compare and contrast the Dynasty Forge Shobu with the Cold Steel Warrior Katana, which is this one. Dynasty Forge, Cold Steel. The Cold Steel has the arrows, the Dynasty Forge has the higo. I'll try to point them out as we go along. Anyway, so what you can see in terms of the kashira area is that the Cold Steel at least has a slightly different sheen on it, but again, very similar. Dynasty Forge has kind of these removable shirodome pieces. The Cold Steel appears to be cast in here. Notably, the Cold Steel Katana not held up, though I can't say it always does. On my example from the previous review, it did. In terms of the materials here, you can kind of distinguish that these are different things. The silk on the Dynasty Forge kind of just hits the light differently. The Cold Steel reflects more so, and I would say the Dynasty Forge feels more real than the Cold Steel does. Cold Steel is tighter than the Dynasty Forge in terms of ito. It moves a little different, though a lot of that's really subjective to how much these have been used. They're two kind of used examples, though I would speculate that the Cold Steel example I have is quite a bit newer. Anyway, Dynasty Forge has looser ito. Cold Steel has more kind of plasticky feeling ito. They could be used, from the same manufacturer, from using the same materials, just different batches, different runs. But I would say that these seem to be made differently. The pattern and how they reflect the light and how they feel, which isn't something that you're able to necessarily tell, do feel different. The Samigawa panels on the Dynasty Forge appear to be marginally larger, but both of them would classify as small. The diamonds on both of these products wander all over the place, and I would not qualify either of them as good. The Minuki are both brass and seem to be made in the same type of vein and with the same or similar levels of quality, just with different themes. This is proving to be more difficult than I expected. The Fuchi and Kashira both have similar issues. Again, the patina on them looks marginally different, but they share kind of the same assembly style and imperfections. The fit and finish on the Cold Steel is probably a little bit better than the Dynasty Forge. There's a slight ledge here, and I don't feel that on the Cold Steel. I can also make out kind of the panels along the Dynasty Forge piece slightly more. You can maybe see it right in here. There's like Hishigami lines, and I don't make that out in the Cold Steel, at least not as substantially. The cold steel, you can see, has a much more elaborate pattern on it and appears to be cast. The Dynasty Forge piece has a lot more tool markings on it and is, I don't know, it's just a little bit different. I would say that this is probably the largest difference. I make out simple casting on the cold steel, and a lot more, again, tool markings and things like that on the Dynasty Forge. It appears to be like a blued steel, as where the cold steel looks like something else. In terms of scabbard, I'm going to give them both an F-. The cold steel was broken in different ways. The Kurigata came off on the Dynasty Forge piece. The cold steel is cracked. Now, supposedly these are shipped, or at least the cold steel is outside, and the saya is still cracked. And so I don't know what kind of balsa wood these are made from. But in effect, well, I give them props for having metal fittings in terms of the metal kojiri at the end, and I like the tapering. That doesn't excuse the fact that both of these sayas have seen trauma, and basically the cold steel one is broken in a few spots, and the Dynasty Forge one is also broken in a few spots. In either case, not so great. It requires some level of fixing and futzing that I don't think anyone should really be subjected to, and they seem to happen relatively quick. So I'm not sure that as many people have complained about the Dynasty Forge pieces being as problematic, but they seem to be made out of similar materials. In terms of kojiri, I'll let you guess which one's which, because I can't really tell, actually. I'd have to look at the end cap. This is the Dynasty Forge, this is the cold steel. They look very, very similar in terms of construction, fit, and build quality. Now I'm going to move on to the blades, and do excuse some of this. Obviously the cold steel has been sharpened, the Dynasty Forge has kind of schmutz on it, but do notice that they appear to reflect similarly. Whatever metal they're using appears to be made in a similar capacity, and this is kind of what I'm talking about. The cold steel could almost be a Shobu Zakuri style blade were it not for this arbitrary yakote that's put on here designating this okasaki. Now granted, this does look a little thinner, but the kind of profile of the cold steel is a little thicker. Anyway, I would say they have some very striking similarities in terms of overall build quality. Obviously there are two different style blades, but they are very, very similar in a number of ways. And then if I move over here to the habaki, all right, there's a frame that accommodates both. I totally know what I'm doing. All right, so these habaki look very, very similar to me. Two different manufacturers, two different swords, but very, very similar styles all in all. Similar along the spine, similar along the front, and similar scratch patterns. The skill on tying the knots, albeit the material being different, I mean, basically these generally to me look like they're made at the same place. I would speculate that they're from the same manufacturer anyway, with marginal differences. Anyway, those are my thoughts. You can throw what you think in the commentary down below. All right, swordsmiths, I'm going to wrap things up. I've lost my train of thought too many times to continue this sword video. I will end by saying I think that this is a nice sword, but for the money, I'm a bit disappointed. The kurikata being broken, the knot coming undone, those are disappointing things. And also, it looks very similar to the cold steel blade, and if you wanted an alternative to a cold steel blade, this might be worthy, or certainly something to consider. I like the feel of it more, and I'm glad that there are some differences in measurements, and it makes me think I'm not just entirely biased against one. That said, they have some problems, honestly, the cold steel and this Dynasty Forge piece in terms of manufacturing. I think that any problem that I see on the Dynasty Forge could manifest itself on some cold steel were you to buy that, or vice versa. I do think that the manufacture of this one is a little bit more elegant. I like the way it moves a little bit more. I find it to be a handsome sword. I like the Musashi style theme. That said, you know, if you're looking for backyard shenanigans fun, nothing about this blade suggests that it's going to be bad. It's more that the package might require some work. Also, if you're doing EI, I don't think this is particularly fun to use. It's a bit stout and heavy. If you're doing Tamashigiri, the blade lends itself to doing that reasonably well, but I don't think as well as like a Hanwei Practical XL blade or something with a geometry more bespoke to that particular type of activity. In terms of general backyard fun and just, you know, smacking stuff around, I think that this is a good sword, a stout one, and if you're comparing it to the Hanwei Raptor series or something like that, I think it's worth considering. One of these things, just be prepared for, you know, having to do some maintenance and whatnot on it. If that bothers you, then unfortunately I don't know that I have anything in the $300 price point that avoids these issues entirely, but that said, most of them don't come untied on me. This is a secondhand used one though, so it's worth reiterating that point because age certainly might have something to do with it along with being secondhand. But I'd say I'm not thrilled at the $300 price point for the flaws that I've seen and the sharpness level that I get, but I also don't think it's necessarily a bad deal. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I've rambled on it enough. Hopefully the video has been interesting. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.